Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. We have Dr. Christina Kwauk with us. And welcome, Christina. My pleasure to introduce you. So I'm just going to read out from her bio. Okay, so Dr. Christina Kwauk is a social scientist with an interdisciplinary focus on education for climate action. She's an expert on girls' education in developing countries, 21st century skills and youth empowerment, and the intersections of gender, education, and climate change. Dr. Kwok co-edited a book called Curriculum and Learning for Climate Action towards an SDG 4.7 roadmap for systems change. That was with Dr. Radhika Iyengar. There are also other books she's co-edited. One that's called What Works in Girls' Education, Evidence from the World's Best Investment. She has published numerous policy papers, including the New Green Learning Agenda, Approaches to Quality Education for Climate Empowerment, as well as academic articles on topics in climate change education, gender, health, and international development and education. She works as an education consultant and is a research director at Unbounded Associates. She also serves on the Drawdown Lift Advisory Council, Girls Rising's Advisory Council, the international jury for the UNESCO Prize for Girls and Women's Education, and the Judging Academy for the World's Best School Prizes. Formerly, Christina was a fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, associate director of the Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Communication and Education Project, and head of climate and education at the Education Commission. So a lot of work she's done. And specifically about the talk today, just going to read out from the abstract. Globally, decision makers understand the importance of education for climate action. But when it comes to moving from knowledge to action, decision makers have been slow to shift. This presentation will describe ongoing work with decision makers and stakeholders working to make the shift more quickly. It will introduce two guiding frameworks that Dr. Christina and her colleagues have developed for education systems that speak to the systemic challenges of the climate crisis, including gender inequality, and address a range of priorities for climate action, including the achievement of climate justice. Now, before I give the floor to you, Christina, just a couple of things from sort of my personal. I happen to know Christina for some time at a professional level. We collaborated on one of the books that she's co-edited, my collaborator and I, Vandana Singh. She's here. Fantastic. Hey, Vandana. We contributed a chapter to a book that Christina was editing, and it was an absolute pleasure working with Christina. Very productive, we learned a lot in the process. So, that's sort of just my personal couple of lines of Christina. With that, Christina, please, the floor is all yours. Please take it forward.
Thank you so much, Chirag. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, Sumijit, for helping to coordinate in these last couple of days as well. It's my pleasure to be with you all today, get to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to share my screen so that we have some slides while I move through this presentation. What I'll be presenting to you today is a little bit of sort of my journey to this topic and sort of how in the last couple of years I've sort of left a dream job at a think tank and really working to try to stimulate and catalyze more action at a systems level in ways that I couldn't do at a think tank through more relationship building on a much more micro scale than some of the work that I've done in the past. But then in that process, I have the opportunity to work with decision makers. And some of what I'll present today is a little bit of the journey to kind of realizing sort of what are the conceptual things at stake when it comes to trying to move different audiences, especially different sort of decision-making audiences towards more action around climate change and climate justice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of that journey. And I wanted to premise also that, as Chirag mentioned through my bio, I haven't been in this work for very long. My academic background was in international development and education, and primarily in gender and education. I grew up not really appreciating the environment around me. The outside was always something to be maybe admired from a distance, but never enjoyed, by myself. Whether it was the heat or mosquitoes, so I come to this topic from not a typical sort of climate activist background. It took me many years to sort of begin to understand and appreciate both our natural environment, but also the existential crisis that we face today as humanity. So, definitely not your typical origin story. So I wanted to, especially for those in the room who are sort of interested in the more personal aspects of kind of coming to a career in climate, or, finding a green job or making any job a green job, I'm happy to also talk a little bit about that afterwards. So today I'll describe a little bit of that sort of unconventional and rather serendipitous journey towards climate action, and how that has fueled my work today at my own company and at my sister company, working to support NGOs, donors, and governments and private sector to really step up their game when it comes to addressing the climate crisis through education. So I've broken my talk down into 4 parts. The first part is sort of a point of departure, or the moment at which I became fixated on the climate crisis. And then the second part overviews 2 problems that I encountered, both of which I learned could, if we were to overcome them, could dramatically shift our thinking about what the root cause of inaction is, and then hopefully steer us towards more transformative change. The third part overviews sort of a possible solution. It's kind of a framework for action that I, together with some colleagues, have developed. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Chirag mentioned it's the New Green Learning Agenda. And then the fourth part, I'll provide some examples of how I am doing all this in practice. So to begin, my entree into this work, as I mentioned earlier, was rather serendipitous. So I was, at the time, a fellow at what some would consider a prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C., sort of leading work on gender equality in education. And at the time, I was trying to convince world leaders why we needed to see an increase in global investments in girls' education in low and middle income country contexts. So I was drawing on the evidence of how higher levels of girls' education were strongly associated with green growth, with economic empowerment, reductions in early and forced child marriage in some contexts, reduction in early childbearing, increased agency, and in some contexts, increased agricultural productivity, better maternal and infant health outcomes. The list goes on in terms of all the positive outcomes from investing in girls' education. But then one summer, while I was in London, I was in a meeting with a world leader to discuss a new girls' education initiative that we were spearheading through my work. And she had asked me this completely innocuous question. She asked me, what is the potential impact that climate change can have on girls' education? And at the time, I had absolutely no idea. I mean, surely climate change and the disasters that it creates, and the shocks and the stressors that it creates, surely that would threaten all the progress that we had made as a global community in girls' education. But I didn't understand what the evidence of this was, and I certainly did not hear the girls' education community talking about this. So I began to explore this question and to learn from others, including a visiting fellow from Zimbabwe who was exploring these issues too. And I was really shocked at what I learned. So while climate change may not discriminate when it comes to wreaking its havoc upon the planet, its impacts are most acutely felt by the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society. And so in many low and middle income country contexts, many of which also happen to be some of the most climate vulnerable countries, talking about the most vulnerable and least skilled members of society most often means we're talking about girls and women. So because of strict and constraining gender norms, girls and women are often less exposed to life-saving information, resources, skills, all because they're often excluded from participating in household and community decision-making, as well as in risk reduction activities that might be targeted at a community, but exclude women and girls because of, again, gender norms. Excuse me. So as a result of this exclusion, women have lower life expectancy in the face of natural disasters, and in some cases can make up to as much as 90% of those killed in weather-related disasters. And then those who survive are highly vulnerable to human trafficking and sexual assault during post-disaster recovery in crowded shelters or in temporary camps. Then when we think about both the prolonged and the short-term weather-related crises, household coping mechanisms also often put girls at higher risk of school withdrawal in order to help complete household responsibilities, whether that's fetching water in times of drought or even potentially engaging in forced early marriage because of the dowries that can help ease the burden of stretching scarce household resources across multiple family members. So when we think about these kinds of coping responses, these responses threaten to change the course of girls' futures, perpetuating their marginalization and thus their vulnerabilities in ways that will have very long-lasting impact. And so before COVID, UNESCO had estimated that approximately 130 million girls, so it's 130 million girls of school-going age were out of school due to poverty, harmful gender practices like early and forced child marriage, and other social and economic factors. And at the time, when we were just beginning to come back online, after COVID, early estimates suggested that the number would grow by 20 million more girls just because of school closures from COVID. And then if we thought that was bad already, these numbers would increase by 12.5 million more girls a year due to the social and economic impacts of extreme weather events. So for girls, their access to education often becomes collateral damage in the face of climate change. But while while the evidence suggests these extreme harmful effects and the damaging effects that climate change can have on girls and women in low and middle income country contexts, from all the research that I was doing before that on why an investment in girls' education was the best investment, surely well-educated girls and women could be a powerful part of the solution, right? So indeed, through my continued research, it was quite clear that there was not just one reason, but three reasons. And I'll go through this now, if I can advance my screen. There you go. So the first reason is that quality, transformative, and empowering education for girls and boys, including comprehensive sexuality and reproductive health education, strengthens girls' sense of agency, their self-efficacy, their bodily autonomy, as well as her sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so when we look at this at a global level, data suggests that there is a quite strong positive association between the average amount of schooling that a girl receives in her country and our country scores on indices that measure vulnerability to climate-related disasters. And so all of this particular relationship is grounded on the evidence that suggests that increased levels of female education is strongly linked to smaller, more sustainable, and more resilient families, because increasing the years of schooling for girls helps to delay the first age of birth, increases the spacing between births, and also decreases infant and child mortality. So when we think about this in the context of climate change, achieving this bare minimum level of progress and outcomes for girls, as well as for people who can become pregnant, this could result in an easing of population demand on natural resources and pressure on Earth's ecosystems over time. So perhaps some of you have heard of this particular reason as an important reason for investing in girls' education, together with rights-based voluntary family planning. This has been highlighted by Project Drawdown as one of the most powerful climate solutions in terms of its potential to reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And in Drawdown's current modeling, health and education is outranked only by one solution in terms of its potential carbon reduction output. And that's that number one solution is reducing food waste. And number two is a combined emphasis on health and education. The second reason why girls' education is a powerful climate strategy is that quality education plays a critical role in fostering girls' leadership and women's capacity to participate in climate decision-making. So we already know the importance of formal education and mentorship on the trajectories of women in corporate and political leadership positions. But now we also know that there's a clear linkage between women's leadership and pro-environmental outcomes. So countries with greater representation of women in parliament and greater political empowerment of women in general are more likely to ratify environmental treaties. They're more likely to have bolder and more stringent climate policies. And they're also even more likely to have lower carbon footprints. At a more local level, when we look at girls and women that are better educated and included in decision-making at all levels, we also see that their families and communities are better able to plan for, cope with, and rebound from climate crises. So a really good reason to invest in girls' education. And finally, the third reason is that quality education plays a critical role in ensuring girls develop what I like to call a breadth of green skills, not only to adapt to and navigate a climate impacted world, but also to adapt to and navigate a changing world of work, and one that we hope will become greener. So this particular reason is important given the marginalization of women already to the fringes of our present fossil fuel driven and fossil fuel dependent economic systems. If we want to see, or if we do see, green sector industries becoming the driving economic force that they're being projected to become, then centering girls and women in this transition will be vital to their inclusion in an alternative, regenerative, and more inclusive economic system. So with these three reasons, surely with these three reasons, as well as all the different sustainable development goals that these reasons touch upon, then every country in the world would be focusing on girls' education, right? I was probably a little too naive in thinking that, because my next line of inquiry led to some rather disappointing findings. In particular, countries are not leveraging girls' education as a climate solution, and they're also not leveraging climate education as a climate solution. So in some analysis that I did with Education International, we were analyzing countries' updated, revised, and new nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, which are their countries' national strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the climate crisis. So in that analysis, we found that less than 1/3 of NDCs mention climate change education. And only 9 NDCs out of 140 are talking about girls in the context of their education. 3 of those are doing so in the context of climate change education, but 0 formally recognizes the contributions that an investment in girls' education could make towards their climate strategy. So this includes the 30 countries in the world where girls' education is threatened the most by climate change. So even though we know girls and women bear a disproportionate burden of the climate crisis, our climate solutions are not working to remedy this. So what's the problem? What's behind this massive inaction at the global policy level? So this is where I began to start looking very deeply and critically at some of our underlying problems. And then in this case, the problem starts with how we're framing the climate crisis. And this matters because how we frame the climate crisis defines our climate solutions. So I think probably many of you in the room today know that climate change is a pretty big technical challenge, right? It's due to human activity over the last century. The Earth's atmosphere now contains way more greenhouse gas emissions than it can naturally absorb, trapping heat, causing average temperatures to rise, and so on. So with the problem focused on greenhouse gas emissions, and especially on carbon dioxide, the solution that follows is to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere by both removing existing emissions and mitigating against further emissions. And then when we think about it that way, one of the social adaptations needed is a transition from high carbon economies to low or carbon neutral economies, or we can call it a green economy. So the implications for the education sector within this framing of the problem is that the education sector's job is to build a workforce with the specific capacities needed to support such a transition. So, but the issue is that climate change is not just a technical problem, it's also a sociological problem. It's an adaptive challenge, which requires not just the technical skills for carbon capture technology or for wind turbine technicians, but also requires new ways of being, thinking, and doing in the world. So on the one hand, we can frame this adaptive challenge as rooted in unsustainable behaviors at the individual level. So this includes one's consumption patterns, your energy usage, your lifestyle choices, and so on, right? And at this individual level, the role of education then is to shift the individual's generic capacities towards those that generate more sustainable behaviors and innovations and ideas. So this can include things like improving the individual's awareness of climate change and their knowledge of the solutions, whether that's driving electric cars, recycling, or in the case of this image here, vertical farming. But the adaptive challenge of climate change isn't just a problem of unsustainable behaviors. It's also one of our human systems, right? So to this effect, if we conceptualize the climate crisis as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, including policies that perpetuate environmental racism or economies that incentivize extractive and polluting industries, then the role of education expands to developing the transformative capacities of individuals and society to catalyze broader systems change for both social and climate justice. So each one of these conceptualizations is valid. The climate crisis is certainly a technical crisis. It is certainly about greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also an adaptive challenge. It's both individual and systemic, right? And so just as there is no single solution to climate change, there's also no single educational solution for climate action. But the challenge is that whenever leaders and decision makers devise their climate action strategies, they're primarily focused on a singular aspect of the climate crisis, and that's greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, they're focused on one pathway of solutions, which is closing the emissions gap. And this means that, as they're focused on closing the emissions gap between, I think probably everyone in this room, since it's an environmental studies group, you probably all know what the emissions gap is, and that's closing the gap between the projected levels of greenhouse gas emissions under a business as usual, and then the level of emissions reductions that are needed in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target, right? So this is where you'll typically see policy discussions about decarbonization and the transition to renewable energies in a green economy. And of course, that is absolutely necessary. It's what, in the short term, our planet absolutely needs at the moment, right? But the problem with this is that then we are unlikely to hear among policy discussions the urgent need to close the education gap. And so this gap, similar to the emissions gap, this is the difference between our levels of climate knowledge, green skills, and climate consciousness under an education as usual scenario, and the level that these need to be increased to in order to achieve our climate mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and sustainability goals. So again, I point this out not to say that we should not concern ourselves with the emissions gap. It's actually quite the contrary. The work that I've been doing really suggests that in order to close the emissions gap, we need to close the education gap, because closing the education gap means that we're ensuring that everyone has the knowledge about climate change and its solutions, and that everyone has the green skills and the attitudes needed to engage in climate-friendly behaviors and to adapt and adopt low carbon lifestyles and renewable technologies. And importantly, it also means that everyone has the mindsets and the awareness of how individual and collective action can help bring down greenhouse gas emissions. But, again, another but, to close the education gap, we have to consider what kind of education we're talking about. We're the most educated in human history, yet we're also the most destructive to ourselves and to the planet. And this is also kind of the space in which Chirag and Vandana have both contributed a chapter in the book that Radhika and I co-edited. This is really thinking about sort of the learning aspects, the learning crisis. And this is actually the part 2 of sort of the problem identification that I sort of went through conceptually through my work. Because when we're talking about transforming education and addressing the learning crisis, and for those of you who aren't aware, so the learning crisis really describes sort of the situation, how globally today, over 250 million children who have actually gone through primary school still cannot read a simple sentence or complete a basic math problem. So the idea here is, how might we look at the learning crisis differently in the context of the climate crisis? So this is where I began to interrogate not only the framing of the climate crisis, but also the framing of the learning crisis and how that could potentially help us to reshape the education solutions that follow. So I like to use Stephen Sterling's framework here for considering, what is that path to systems change through education? And oftentimes when we hear education policymakers talk about, how do we change education or how do we improve education, the efforts are often focused on doing things better, or this first highlighted row here. And in the context of climate change, these conversations are oftentimes relegated to things like, how do we do things greener? How do we recycle more at school? How do we build rain gardens? How do we compost at school? How do we add climate change education into the curriculum? These kinds of conversations are definitely important, but they risk engaging in what we call conformative change, that at the end of the day functions to maintain much of the status quo and to sustain the systems and the structures that have led to our present condition. Mainly things like socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality, poverty, time poverty, as well as issues of how the education system itself is entangled in a fossil fuel economy and in extractive relationships with communities and so on. And so this perpetuation of the status quo is because the kind of change that doing things better is really about achieving greater efficiency and effectiveness in our existing system. So it ends up solving problems in education, regardless of whether that system is actually the right one. And at the same time, we oftentimes hear policymakers talking about doing better things, or what is much more reformative change that merely grants more equal access and opportunity to previously disenfranchised populations into an existing system. So an example of this might be, decision makers or policymakers thinking about how to ensure our lowest income communities or our tribal communities or our environmental justice communities might get equal access to school rooftop solar grants, or to electric school buses, or to outdoor learning facilities, or something of that nature. So of course, that kind of change in action is critical for equity reasons, but these efforts oftentimes miss addressing underlying root causes of inequity. So why are these communities, for example, excluded from these solar rooftop grants? Or why are these communities excluded from outdoor learning facilities and so on? So instead, the urgency and scale of the climate crisis and the increasingly shorter window of time that we have to take action calls for decision makers to start seeing and doing things differently. And that means to confront long-time problems of education and to commit to the difficult transformative change that can significantly alter not only the system itself, but its underlying purpose and its values. And so by seeing things differently, stakeholders can see that education as we know it, which is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, is actually part of the problem, perpetuating social norms and social structures that are harmful to both people and planet. So under this sort of framing of the learning crisis, the solution then is to disrupt the status quo and to reorient the purpose of our education system towards climate action. which requires the simultaneous achievement of gender equality, racial equality, intergenerational and climate justice, and so on. So if those ways of framing the problem of climate change in education are driving inaction by the education sector when it comes to climate action, what are the potential solutions? Especially if it's not just any type of education for climate action that we're calling for. And so with this, this is another sort of conceptual series of work that I did as well, really, again, drawing on the work of the girls' education community who through decades of efforts and community-led discussions and so on, really began to try to understand, what are we talking about when we're talking about change? And while the goal for girls' education stakeholders was always clear, right, that achieve gender equality in and through education, implementation often fell short because program design wasn't always aligned to the vision. And so over time, the girls' education community as a field began to harmonize around terminology, which is captured in this continuum that you see here. And this really helped the field to begin to fundamentally shift how gender equality in education programming was designed and for what purpose, whether that was from fixing or empowering the individual to addressing root causes of gender inequality at the systems level. And so, excuse me, if we applied these lessons to climate change in education, we might see something like this, right? Where we might begin to harmonize our terminology around the ultimate goal of achieving climate justice. So again, just to walk us through this real quickly, on the left side of the continuum, where it's more on the climate injustice side, it's education as we know it. And in contexts like the US, I mean, this is where your school systems might completely be ignoring the climate crisis, or might even be teaching wrong information about the climate crisis due to fossil fuel, fossil fuel endorsed curriculum and materials and pedagogies in the classroom, right? And then on the other end of the continuum is more towards climate justice, where the education is all about addressing underlying social, political, and economic drivers of the climate crisis, and really working to transform those harmful structures and systems of oppression. So if we think about this continuum in terms of what kind of education do we mean, and how might that type of education lead to certain types of systems change? When it comes to talking to education decision makers, something like this is a good heuristic for at least being able to say, where are you, or where are your systems on this continuum of education and climate? But then what does that really mean in terms of the types of pathways or the types of policy options that decision makers have? And so this is where we came to start designing a framework, or what I like to call a new green learning agenda, to really help decision makers conceptualize educational pathways that address the climate crisis with the intention of not just achieving climate action, but also climate justice. So it starts from the position that how we frame the problem underlying the climate crisis shapes our educational pathways, whether we perceive that as a technical challenge or as an adaptive challenge. And then whether, of course, we conceive of the source of the problem as an issue of greenhouse gas emissions, or as unsustainable human behavior, or unjust social and economic systems. And then this framework takes us into account, takes into account whether that vision of the solution is a just transition to a green economy, the development of more sustainable behaviors, or the transformation of more equitable systems. And then from there, it allows decision makers to deliberately consider a continuum of green skills that are needed to fuel a green economy and climate justice. And so just as a way to sort of elaborate very briefly, these skills can be compartmentalized, although they are certainly a continuum and overlapping and interdependent continuum, into skills for green jobs, skills for sustainable behaviors, so what we call green life skills. So this is like orienting communication, problem solving, communication, critical thinking, empathy towards solving problems of sustainability. and then also a feminist planetary consciousness, or skills for a green transformation, that really gets at understanding the interconnected social and planetary challenges that we face as society. So with this sort of framework of not only pathways for action, a framework for thinking about a breadth of green skills, my colleagues and I, both at my own company, Kwauk and Associates, as well as my sister company, Unbounded Associates, this is kind of where our climate action is now located. It's in helping to manifest a new green learning agenda in practice by helping education actors to really jumpstart their own work on climate by giving them the boost and the support that they might need. So I left my career at a think tank that I mentioned before to really focus on this area of work, and in many ways kind of make my job a climate job, whether my job description was so, and really working with a vast, diverse group of stakeholders to really move action towards this direction. And I know I have been talking way too long, and maybe I will just stop here at sort of where some of the examples of this in practice, to see if you all have any questions or anything that you want me to dive a little bit deeper in before I swallow up too much of our time. So maybe Chirag or Simranjit, I don't know if you want, if I should take a pause here for questions or go further into thinking about examples.
I think, Christina, please go ahead with the examples.
Okay.
We can take
I'll
questions.
I'll go through quickly. Okay. All right. So a few examples of the work that myself and my sister company have done to support decision makers and stakeholders to translate their work in education into an entry point into the new green learning agenda. So I'll go through 3 examples really quickly. So this first one was working together with a large INGO to help shift workforce development organizations to see how they could use their work developing technical skills for green jobs as an entry point to building a breadth of green skills for youth in a green economy. So this was working with these organizations to understand sort of the scope and scale of transferable green life skills, like what I said earlier, problem solving, adaptability, and so on, as well as the transformative green skills, like a focus on justice, equity, the ability to run workshops, engage stakeholders, initiate strategic planning, build collective action. These were all, a much broader range of green skills than these workforce development organizations and decision makers were ever used to thinking about. And so through this work, we work together with youth ecopreneurs from around the world to hear their perspective of the types of skills that were most important in building their enterprises, their green enterprises, whether that was in climate smart agriculture, nature-based solutions, or other green initiatives. And we worked, together with these young people to synthesize kind of what were the key skills, what were the key challenges and barriers to really starting a sustainable livelihood through green enterprise or so on, and really kind of distill that for decision makers within the workforce development community. And so this was just kind of one example of again, targeting, a paradigm shift within their work as a community to really go beyond just thinking of themselves as, providing technical training in a particular industry or a particular trade, to really thinking about them becoming providers and sort of spaces for developing critical green life skills and green transformation, green transformative skills for systems transformation. This one was some work that we did together with the Commonwealth of Learning to help shift government officials' perceptions and government officials in the education ministries, and shift their perceptions that climate change is just a technical challenge of greenhouse gas emissions that is the purview of your Ministry of Environment or your Ministry of Climate or Ministry of Transportation, to viewing climate change as an adaptive problem in which the education sector not only has a large stake to play, a large stake in the game, but also a large role to play. And so with this one, it was really about demonstrating not only the vast ways in which climate change could impact the education sector, but again, thinking critically about those pathways, the pathways for not only framing how the climate crisis entailed the education system, but then also what the education system could actually do, whether that was to expand their technical vocational education and training options to thinking about a breadth of green skills, or thinking about primary and secondary education, delivery of climate topics and integrate those topics throughout the curriculum, or so on, right? So this was working with Ministry of Education officials to get them to see that the climate crisis was that they had something to do in terms of a role to play and action to take on this topic. And then the final example is this workbook that we did together with another large INGO to support adolescent youth and education decision makers in both the formal and the non-formal education space, to shift from seeing climate empowerment initiatives as an issue of individual behavioral change to one rooted in collective action. And therefore, the need to build such collective action skills among young people. So a lot of coalition building and such. So this one was, again, thinking about, what are young people currently exposed to when it comes to knowledge about the climate crisis, and importantly, climate decision-making and climate negotiation, and then identifying ways to translate that into opportunities to build transformative green skills for collective action, thinking about skills, again, like solidarity, political agency, and working and navigating power dynamics. So this one was particularly focused on sort of formal and non-formal education spaces. All right, so again, to be clear, we need all three approaches simultaneously, because all three approaches help us to multi-solve or to simultaneously tackle some of our hardest and most systemic challenges when it comes to sustainable development as well as climate crisis. But when we break it down in this way, decision makers and implementers can really gauge where their educational institutions or their programs are located at the moment, and then identify partners that can help complement and expand their approach so that they have a breadth of these pathways being implemented. Because again, just as I mentioned before, there's no single solution for climate change. I think we have to start viewing the same thing for education. There's no single educational solution. We need them all. And we think that a new green learning agenda can be one way of getting there in an equitable and a just way. All right, that's all I got. I will end screen share and see if there are any questions or areas that you'd like to dig a little deeper in.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was a very clear talk, and really a lot of takeaways there. In fact, I took a couple of screenshots of your slides because I want to go back and think about it more carefully. I'm teaching this course, and while you were speaking, I actually thought of the things that I've missed covering in my course and so on. So really, personally, I found it exceedingly enriching. Thank you so much. We already have Aditi, who wants to ask you a question. Please go ahead.
Great.
Hi. Hi, Christina. Lovely talk. Absolutely amazing. I also had a lot of takeaways from the talk. My question is, while it's the entire thought and the theme of gender in decreasing the gender gap and education gap is very essential. There are, if you look at any particular region specifically, let's say Asia, you'll have some regions which are more prone to climate disasters. So they are more at risk compared to the other regions. And of course, in a country like India, we, in addition to racial problems, we also have a caste problem. We also have a rural and urban divide where, certain sections, while more at risk, are also do not have enough resources. So in terms of educating them about climate, and of course with rural populations, like especially communities which are, say, involved in agricultural work, or say tribal communities who are sort of more sort of connected to climate and nature in their own traditional pathways, it becomes very difficult to, sort of address education as, one single topic to be addressed. I mean, like you said, it doesn't have a single solution. So how would you address the geographical, specifically the geographical differences between certain regions which might be more at risk compared to the other regions which may not be more at risk but may have more resources to address this? Is there a way to differentiate? Because I know, I mean, the racial and caste inequities are on a different level altogether to be addressed. But on a geography scale, if you could give a few comments, I'd be grateful.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, because it's a good reminder too that when we try to tackle, at least from what I've seen, if we try to tackle the climate change education from an all-encompassing single kind of approach, it becomes really difficult to capture the nuanced experiences of climate change that specific communities have, because climate change, like we mentioned before, it's incredibly local, right? It spreads its impacts everywhere, but the experience of it is so defined by existing vulnerabilities, existing access to resources, intersecting identities, all of those aspects, right? So so my fear is that, education ministries or school systems will try to tackle climate change education from like an all-encompassing approach, a holistic approach, and miss the very nuanced experiences. And so that's where I think approaches that are like hyper local, where you start at the community level, identify the unique climate risks and hazards at a specific community of learners or community experiences, and build from there up, rather than, I mean, there are commonalities, when it comes to climate science and understanding greenhouse gas effect and all that kind of stuff, right? Like that's common that everyone could learn about. But when it comes to understanding risk and opportunities on the web. Oops, sorry, my watch thinks I was talking to it. But when it comes to identifying risk and hazards and opportunities for action, that's incredibly local, and that draws on community knowledge of, where are the hazards located, which communities are most exposed to those hazards, and therefore what solutions education-wise and, resource-wise are needed. So it's kind of like we have to start working bottom up and top down to help create the opportunities for climate change education, but create room and space for an incredibly local approach to it. So I hope that maybe answers some of your questions.
Yeah, that's amazing. Also, if I may, one small question, Chirag, if that's allowed.
Small question.
Yes. Okay. So what I wanted to ask is, also associated with climate vulnerable communities is migration associated with climate change and climate disasters. And in such cases, of course, as always, education is one of the major sectors which gets affected, especially for women and marginalized genders. So is there any mechanism that you work with to address this specific problem?
Yeah, so the migration one is a tricky one, because once you have displacement, then you have not only sort of the loss of community and the loss of access to those social services, but then you enter a whole different realm of sort of the what's the right word, like a surrogate set of social services. So this is where you get into sort of your education in emergencies, or your refugee education, or things like that, right? Or even then, beyond that, it's more of thinking about host country or host community education systems and how they incorporate displaced people. So it becomes incredibly complex, but there are communities that are very, very focused on those displaced and migrant populations. And I think leaning on the lessons that they have learned from histories of serving displaced populations and integrating a climate lens into that work, I think that's where that field is going, and needs to do more resources to do that work in a good way. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for your question. I see Vandana and Ishita.
I think Ishita was before me. So
Okay.
do you want to go, Ishita?
You raised
Go.
your hand first, you can go.
Go ahead,
Why don't I
Ishita.
just,
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay,
everyone's-
okay, I can ask my question. I found the talk really interesting. Thank you so much for it. But something that I was thinking about was in terms of applying this, and you'd mentioned that you reached out to ministers of education and something in one of the tasks that y'all had done, and transformative change in general is something that requires a lot of convincing to be done, and particularly of this sort, to have adequate training, teachers, enough resources to have something like this done, and enough money to have it done. It's huge. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how you could first convince people that this is something worth investing in, and that this is something important that needs to be done. And second, to be able to channel all those resources and make this something actionable that could take place at a really large scale, because that's ideal.
Yeah. That's a hard question. Thank you for asking that, Ashita. So I think there's a couple of questions embedded in there. And I think part of it is thinking about the wide scale transformative systems change that's needed, right? And just reflecting on the massive fractioning of societies around the world, polarization of societies, and disagreement about what's priority. And so when you think about that, transformative change suddenly seems absolutely unachievable, right? But then when we think about the micro level, or even subnational in some cases, but thinking a much more micro level, and think about sort of the power of radical incremental change, and how that can, once, if sparked in multiple communities, can potentially be a catalyst for much broader systemic transformative change. And that's where I try to focus my attention. It's, not thinking about those massive structures, the UNFCCC negotiation processes, or US politics, or even in India, the politics there, but thinking at a much more micro level, where community decision-making around resource use and resource consumption, and how some of that much more day-to-day decision-making could potentially transform broader systems. Again, thinking about the sort of, the limits, all the limits that are set forward by our planet, but then also our social systems, and just our cognitive systems too, when it comes to solving complex problems. So my tendency is to try to think at a much more micro level, and think about, how might you empower the single teacher in your community, in a school, to do something radical, and then have that spark, further transformation at the school level. And then once you have a school, how might that school spark further transformation in a district of school, or a collection of schools, and so on, And I think maybe that's where we need to focus our attention, because you'll find youth climate activists, you'll find community climate activists, environmental justice activists everywhere. How might we, create communities of support around those collections of individuals, to really spur that more radical incremental change that can then, spill over to the bigger scales of transformation. I don't know, maybe it's just my naivety speaking. Vandana?
Hi, and thank you for an excellent talk, Christina. It's great to see you again.
You too.
I am, so I have a comment, and then I also have a question. So my comment is that, basically, well, a couple of them. One is that you talked about the girls' education and health education on Project Drawdown, and one of the things I do in my classroom is have students analyze solutions from different places, including there. And one of the things that they have pointed out, I think, is that perhaps Project Drawdown doesn't address sufficiently which you did, that the quality of education, that it has to be quality transformative education. And what does that mean? And that's something that's missing there, because as my students recognized, people who are highly educated are not necessarily low emissions people. In fact, it's the other way around. So the quality of education is really important. And I'm so glad you emphasized that. Also, one of the other things that you mentioned about the micro level and the local level, and in response to Aditi's point about marginalized groups, I'm just going to put a link in the chat of this incredible effort by some young people in the town of Chennai in South India, very close to Krea, where they are working with the Fisher community. And it's a short video, and it's about one of the other points that you made in the first report that you'd written that I read, the one about roadblocks to quality education, that often people assume that literacy and eco-literacy are two separate things, and that eco-literacy is not valued as much as literacy is. But among other things, what these people have discovered is that when you are sort of co-producing ecological knowledge, then it actually affects literacy rates. They go sky high. So it's some really interesting work out there. So I wanted to, that was my comment. And my question has to do with the fact that, as we all know that, and you've alluded to this, that not all ministers of education or governments or whatever are going to be open to transformative change, because after all, they benefit from the status quo. And particularly in countries where, more right-wing governments, more authoritarian governments are in power, where often they don't even want comprehensive climate education at the left end of the spectrum you showed us. And so I was wondering, I think that some of the things you've said are really powerful. And I was wondering how, are there any strategies that you've perhaps thought of? How do we work in countries where the governments don't even pay lip service, and perhaps push against any kind of transformative education agenda because they benefit from the status quo? So,
yeah, that's another hard question. My initial sort of confrontation avoidant personality is to say, leave those countries and leave those communities to their own, own volitions, and let's work with the coalition of the willing first. That's like my first initial thing. But obviously that's not the best, that's not the way forward, right? I think that there is a way, especially when we look at the US context and we see how, for example, the conservative parties and the Republicans in the US are beginning to come to climate issues. And that's through an economic argument. It's still, it's all about benefits still, right? But it's through a slightly different entry point. And I wonder if that is, especially as we begin to see how a shift to cleaner technologies and cleaner energies is a positive win on the economic side, especially when it comes to ensuring energy needs are met at a good price. Like, I feel like there are some of those entry points, and what that might look like in different contexts depends on, what are the sort of the economic and political issues that those communities are facing. But I feel like there is an entry point in some way, because whether that's, the disaster, the spending towards recovering from disaster, and if rebuilding after disaster after disaster after disaster at a more increased frequent rate means that something has to be done, then, how might we leverage those entry points that speak to the pockets of those decision makers, help create space for some level of action that can then sort of seed a little bit more space for kind of moving, again, that incremental movement towards transformative change, how might we be able to use that as the initial opening the door kind of moment? And in places where environmental defenders' lives are at risk, I mean, how do you do that in a way that's safe? How do you do that in a way that, I think it's about incrementalism at that point, and how to do that in a way that doesn't create further harm. I don't know. That's a really tough question. Yeah, I think that's more voices in there. I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps we need to brainstorm about this further. But yes, indeed, I know it's not an easily answerable question. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah. No, I know it's easy for me to get just kind of spill into the naivety and the idealism. But the reality is that, there are contexts where that's not possible. So, yeah.
I seem to recall, Christina, although I forget the details. I didn't follow it in too much detail anyway. But I don't know if it's all over Catalonia, but definitely at least in Barcelona, students ended up forcing climate education, compulsory climate education into university syllabi, right?
Yep.
And that, I think, as I recall, it really was the students that forced their hand. So maybe there is some hope that this kind of bottom-up approach, given enough size of community, in this case students, who demand this, it can actually be incorporated in places which otherwise may not have done it for a much longer time. We are already past an hour, so I think we'll call this session to a close. Christina, thank you so much. Really, it was a pleasure listening to everything that you said about your work, and I look forward to hearing more after some time, once you've made more inroads into but with the initiatives that you have going. Thank you so much. And thanks also to everyone else for being here with us. And look forward to your next talk, Christina.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me.
See you.
Thanks for your time,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.